Kia ora and welcome to the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation's Activist-in-Residence program. And today we are talking to an activist, as I've often said this, who has inspired me in very fundamental ways since my very early work as a researcher. We are talking to Jolovan Wham, and welcome Jolovan as our next activist in residence. I'm extremely proud to share with you that Jolovan has a history of being the sort of activist that in many ways I would say is the conscience of a society. So when one asks the question, what does an activist really do, or why does an activist need to do a particular action, I have often looked at you, Jolovan, as an example of someone who actually makes very principled choices as ways for communicating with the rest of us, an ethic perhaps of possibilities, imagining that which can be possible if societies were to be more egalitarian and democratic. Jolovan is with us this week, and he will be working on the question of first world authoritarianism, and we'll be working on a paper together on communicative strategies for resisting authoritarianism. Jolovan Wham is a Singaporean activist who has been involved in human rights activism, working primarily on issues related to migrants, the death penalty, and freedom of expression. He was executive director of the humanitarian organization for migrant economics, or HOME, an NGO which provides shelter, education opportunities, and legal aid for low-wage migrant workers in Singapore. And that's how we actually got to meet for the first time in 2008.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
When you were working with migrant construction workers.
Yes.
Yes. And you gave some really amazing insights about the ways in which that space was organized. He's a member of the Community Action Network, a coalition of activists which promotes civil and political rights. He obtained his bachelor's degree in social work from the National University of Singapore, or NUS, and that actually is, one of the questions I'm going to ask him is that how does one imagine possibilities of democracy and equality with a pedagogy from within a structure that is very much built within authoritarian logics. His activism has resulted in him being banned by the education minister from speaking at education institutes and campuses, under the notion that teachings on resistance and dissent are against the interests of Singapore. So I think, one of the really interesting touch points of our conversation today and throughout this week is going to be, what is the meaning of dissent in society? Why do we need dissent in society? What role does dissent play in giving us the basis for imagining ethical societies? Authoritarianism is on the rise globally, and this is particularly of concern because of the mobility of models such as the Singapore model. The Singapore model is often sold as a model for effective governance, while often obfuscating the forms of calibration and authoritarian control. Commentators often point out that this trend in long-standing liberal democracies such as the US and India also points to particular ways in which the authoritarian model moves across countries and contexts. So in that sense, although we will be talking about Jolovan's work within the context of Singapore, it has relevance for a global audience, particularly in terms of thinking through strategies of challenging this rise of authoritarianism. So welcome, Jolovan. Once again, I'm so excited to reconnect with you, and I'm hoping that this week is going to give us many lessons to learn from you.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. So let's maybe begin by talking a little bit about sort of what got you interested in social work.
Right. I come from a middle-class family in Singapore, so my parents, like many middle-class families, hire live-in domestic worker. So that was actually the first time in my life I was coming in contact with migrant worker. So and I used to have to share a room with our live-in domestic worker, and I used to talk to her a lot, and she would tell me stories about her life. So that gave me a glimpse, some kind of idea about what it was like to be a live-in help in someone else's house. And I would observe the interactions that she would have with my family and my mother in particular, because she was the official employer and supervisor of the domestic worker, and I could immediately sense the power imbalance. And of course, I wasn't able to articulate it in the way that I can now, but I always felt a strong sense of something being wrong. Yeah, that here was a woman in my house whom I'm close to because she shares the same room as me, but yet at the same time she is unable to have autonomy over her actions. She doesn't even have her own space. She has to live in the same room as I did. So this gave me a sense of how structurally, there was a problem, within that relationship, though I was unable to articulate it. So when I went into university, I decided to study social work, because I was interested in helping people, right? So, but it was just a very vague notion of helping, So I had no conception of what rights were, what was social justice, So I just had a very conservative, conventional notion of what it meant to do something for those who were disadvantaged,
So in many ways, it was very personal.
Yes, it was very personal. It came from my experiences with having a migrant worker in the house, and I wanted to find out more about what kinds of help I could give to the migrant worker community, and perhaps what were some of the challenges that they faced, apart from the ones that I learned having a living domestic worker in my house. So, but at the time, there weren't any organizations that were looking into this issue, apart from the embassies. So, but I finally found an organization that provided some basic services for migrants, and it was within the Catholic Church. So then I volunteered at the church for about 2 years. And there I got to know Bridget. Bridget is the founder of the organization that I eventually joined. And she told me that she wanted to set up home and whether I would be interested to help her do that. And I thought, wow, that's a great opportunity. I mean, I was a fresh graduate. I knew I wanted to do something with migrants. So since she was going to set up this organization, then I said, yes, why not? Let me help you. And she wanted to break away from the church, because I knew her through the church, and they were working on, and they were providing services to migrants. And I decided that, because I'm not Catholic, I wasn't religious at all, and since she wanted to set up something that was secular, I wanted to join her to do that.
So let's rewind a little bit. What was it like pursuing social work at the university?
Right. It's social work at the National University of Singapore is basically what they do is they train you to implement government assistance programs. And they teach you social work in a way that's quite divorced of its political context. So you act as technicians, in a way, and what you do, and there isn't any sense of a liberatory praxis or any sense of social justice in the way that it's taught. Human rights and issues relating to minorities are hardly talked about. So it's a very depoliticized curriculum, and you are just expected to help individuals adjust and fit in back to society, rather than pursue ideals of social justice and upholding human rights.
So, it's fascinating because when you talk about what moved you in this journey was, an awareness of the power inequalities.
Yes.
And yet it seems like at the university, the curriculum that you were studying had very little to do with power or intrinsic formations of power in the delivery of care.
Right. We didn't talk about power at all. All we talked about was what were the effective ways in which services could be delivered. How could interventions be done to uplift people out of poverty, but without questioning why people are in poverty in the first place, and how structures reinforce their subjugated positions, and how even social work itself enables this kind of subjugation. So there was very little critical thinking. Yeah.
How did you negotiate that in the uni days?
Thankfully, there was the internet. So the internet is actually quite revolutionary for authoritarian societies, because when you live in a country where information is controlled by the state, you end up only being brainwashed. Yeah. So having access to information on the internet and also in the library, actually, even though what was taught to us in social work was very conservative, was very constricting, I did find a few gems in the library. Yeah. So I read about structural social work, progressive social work, and I remember thinking to myself, why aren't we talking about all these things in class? Yeah. And so seeing that possibilities, alternatives to the social work in Singapore was possible by reading these books just opened up my eyes and my mind to other ways in which I could practice.
So when was it so you graduated and then you joined Home?
That's right.
When was it that you joined Home?
It was in 2004.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's been 15 years. Yes.
Wow. And having worked with many foreign domestic workers, one of the things that I have often witnessed is the ways in which you're seen in that space and community as an ally.
Right.
You
yes.
know? So what has that journey been like for you?
It's been quite, I often feel very uncomfortable actually within that space, because I am aware that I am a Singaporean, and I'm a man, and I'm Chinese of the majority race, so I have a lot of privilege, and I often end up being the one speaking for migrant workers. In fact, that's how people get to know me, because I'm often very critical of the state, and I say a lot of things about migrant worker issues. But ideally, it should be the migrant workers themselves speaking up and talking about issues that matter to them. Yeah. So that has always made me very uncomfortable. But it is almost impossible, for migrant workers to be able to do that and yet continue to work in Singapore, because the authoritarian regime makes it difficult for them to do so. So anyone who speaks up runs the risk of losing their jobs, runs the risk of being charged in court and being convicted. And Singapore has very strict laws on speech and assembly, and if you are found guilty, you may be blacklisted and you won't be able to come back to Singapore to work. So organizing migrant workers and getting them involved in advocacy and activism is very difficult because of this. Of these punitive measures that the state has that it can use against them. Yeah.
So, in that sense, it's a precarious position for you as well to negotiate.
Yes, that's right.
Being aware of your privilege and placing that privilege at the same time in solidarity with ongoing struggles.
Yes, that's right. And also migrant workers are often socialized into thinking that they should occupy that subjugated position. So often when we have discussions, and they may turn to me and look to me for approval, right? And finding ways in which I can equalize the power relationship has always been a struggle. Yeah, because it's easy to want to just decide to follow the script, yeah, that has been written, because it's just so much more convenient to do so, right? Rather than democratizing the relationship and thinking of ways in which the community themselves can come to conclusions or come up with their own ideas to do things. Yeah, so it's very easy for someone like me to say, I think this is the best way. Yeah, and it's also often a lot more efficient. Yeah, because if I say yes, and then everyone else will say yes. Yeah, so the challenge then is how do I facilitate the discussions rather than be the one where everyone looks to make the decision.
How do you do that?
Sometimes it just means listening, right, and not saying anything. And sometimes it just means letting the workers themselves debate, discuss, and only providing your perspective and always saying that this is just my perspective. You may have a different way of looking at things and viewing things. So please feel free to decide among yourselves and not have to listen to what I have to say. Yeah. So so framing discussions in this way is necessary. Yeah, if we want to talk about trying to deal with the power imbalance. Yeah.
You know, the one thing that you talked about is sort of the overarching context of Singapore within which low-wage migrant work is situated. So perhaps, you know, for our audience that are not familiar with Singapore, you could share with us a little bit about that context and how it has changed over the years or not changed.
Well, I would say that there is definitely a lot more discussion about these issues now. If we go back to the early days of activism, migrant rights activism during the 1980s, right? So this was a time when the state was a lot more authoritarian. The prime minister had arrested and detained without trial and tortured migrant rights activists. Yeah, so and the prime minister then accused them of trying to overthrow the state with a Marxist conspiracy. So after that happened, there was like a silence in civil society. A lot of people became very scared, and I think a lot of people were afraid and didn't want to pick up on migrant worker issues. So it was only in the early 2000s when groups like Home, TWC2, came up and started to look into this kind, into wanting to do activism on migrant worker issues. So when we started out, there was a lot of tentativeness. Yeah, people were not sure whether this was something which the state would accept, whether there would be any pushback. Yeah. So, but over the years, through our advocacy, we've been able to open up the space, raise awareness, yeah, and even mount campaigns and write letters which are critical of government policy. So this has helped to raise awareness of the issues and also to shape policy, yeah, that would be better for migrant workers. Yeah, but the process has been a very slow one. Yeah, because when you do advocacy in an authoritarian state, yeah, you have to be prepared to really wait a very long time, yeah, before you see the changes that you envision. Yeah.
So how do you do advocacy in an authoritarian state?
Yes. So I think it really depends on the issue, yeah, and whether the state feels that they can trust you. Yeah. So if you are there to be, if you are critical, but you are critical because you say you want to help the state manage the issue better, then you will be seen as an ally. Yeah. But if you take on what they think are more confrontational approaches, confrontational tactics, you name and shame, or you go to international platforms to denounce them, yeah, or you work with foreign media, international media, to highlight the weaknesses of the system, then this is when they will start to see you as having some kind of agenda, yeah, and won't view and won't treat you as nicely as they would other civil society actors, yeah, because then you are seen as having an agenda to undermine them.
So, this whole idea, and I've heard this in other contexts too, you have an agenda.
Right.
It seems to uh, sort of uh, set as abnormal
Right.
anything that is critical.
Right, yes. I mean, everyone has an agenda, but the word agenda is weaponized by the state to say that you want to undermine us, yeah, and you want to delegitimize us, yeah, and that is not allowed. Yeah, that's taboo in Singapore, yeah, because anything that threatens threatens one-party rule and delegitimizes their right to rule the country would be seen as actions which are seditious even, right? Yeah, so that's why activists have to tread that space very carefully, yeah, if they want to stay safe, yeah, and yet be able to push their agenda.
What are you talk about staying safe. What are the risks to activism in Singapore?
Right. So you, in the more extremes, the greater risks are those where the state actually clamps down on you really hard. So this is if they arrest you, they decide to convict you, imprison you, or detain you without trial. Yeah. So that's one extreme end of what the state can do to activists. And on the other end, they could give you veiled threats. They could say things like, "We won't give you any more funding for your programs," or we might even tell your donors not to fund your programs anymore. Yeah, or they will, or they might make it difficult, yeah, for you to do your work. So the permits that you require or the partners that you want to work with to do your work suddenly are not available anymore. Yeah. So these are the more covert ways, yeah, in which censorship, repression is exercised in Singapore, yeah, to make you feel that you can't step out of line and that you can only work within the script that has been given to you.
So, when one says that sure one can be critical
Yes.
in Singapore, are you then saying that there are particular scripts to that too in terms of what does it mean to perform being critical in Singapore?
Yes. So if you are critical, but you must also show that you are balanced, right? So your criticality has to be diluted. So you also need to acknowledge good things that the state has done. Yeah, you also need to be positive about the state, positive about government policies which are good. Yeah. So it's not so what they're looking for is someone who does not speak the unvarnished truth. Yeah, so speaking truth to power is something which they are not interested in, and if you do that, you will find yourself ostracized. Yeah, and they want activists or NGOs to do things like raising awareness and public education. Yeah, but not engage in actions that question power or which dismantles structures, right? Yeah. So it is not a case of the state coming down on you on any forms of dissent. So dissent is, they will say they welcome dissent, yeah. But again, it's only a certain type of dissent that is welcomed, yeah. So it's dissent that is performed on their terms and not yours.
How is that dissent then?
Exactly. But you are conditioned. Yeah, you're conditioned to believe, yeah, that you are critical, except that your criticality helps to tweak policies, change certain things, but not do anything to dismantle the underlying and fundamental structures which perpetuate the injustice in the first place.
And at the end, the state can lay claim to your criticality and say that we accomplished these things.
Yes, that's right. And then they might even then say it publicly that we worked with this organization to do this. Yeah, and these kinds of public acknowledgements actually serve as positive reinforcements to many activists, and they believe that they are on the right track.
While at the same time actually entrenching authoritarian control.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So many activists are actually complicit in the perpetuation of authoritarianism in Singapore. Yeah, and the perpetuation of this kind of injustice.
You know, the one thing that was quite striking to me through the first part of this conversation is the conflation of state and party.
Right.
So, for one to be critical of the state, in this instance, seems like is also being critical of the People's Action Party.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So because it's an authoritarian country, so the party and the state are one. And so the civil servants, the parliamentarians, the judiciary, the trade unions, yeah, so they all follow the same blueprint. They may be different people, but they all have one master. Yeah, so this is how the authoritarianism is constructed in Singapore. Yeah.
So within this context where there seems like there are very powerful forces at work, what gets you going?
Right. I think the communities that I work with motivates me a lot because I work with some really inspiring people. What keeps me going also is, I think, being clear about what my values are and what are important in life. And I'm not interested in just going to a job and, you know, doing the daily grind. Yeah, so I do believe in living a life, yeah, where it's important to stand by on values like justice and human rights, yeah, because this is what makes us a better society, a better community. Yeah, so these are the things which keep me going. And also, I think I also have, because I'm also gay, right? So being marginalized also helps me understand what it is like to live as a disempowered individual in a community. Yeah, so that makes me more empathetic, I suppose, to communities that are more vulnerable. Gives me greater affinity to injustice. Yeah, so that also has an impact on me and how and what I decide to do with my life.
Now, one of the things that seems very strong, and you kind of touched upon this a little bit, is the culture of ostracization.
Yes.
Right, that now you have made so much trouble that you're a troublemaker.
Yeah.
And people stay away from you. How does this kind of ostracization work? That's my first question. But also, it must be sometimes pretty alienating to face the force of that ostracization. And how does one negotiate that?
The ostracization is something that, yes, it can be alienating. I mean, ever since I got charged by the state for being involved in civil disobedience activities, some people look at me a little bit more differently, and or I may even get like very well-meaning advice from friends who tell me what to do and say I shouldn't be involved in this kind of activism. I need to work with the state, etc. Yeah, so it can be alienating and ostracizing in that aspect. But at the same time, I also have friends who support the work that I do. Yeah, so I think it's important to maintain relationships, yeah, with people within the community, and I think this is something in Singapore, at least, that we don't really see a lot of. There are very few communal activities and gatherings for people to come together to talk about issues and to support one another. Yeah, so I've been involved in a lot more of these kinds of activities, and I think that kind of social support has been quite important for me, to prevent myself from being alienated by the community. And also, my work is also defined more than just civil disobedience activities, right? So I also work on other aspects of community work, and I have formed relationships with people in these other aspects of my work. So that has also helped me in terms of not being isolated and alienated from others.
So one thing I find quite interesting is that if you look at the histories of Asia, in many ways, various forms of civil disobedience emerged in cultural practices of Asia. I find it quite ironic that civil disobedience itself is seen as anti-state or against the interests of the nation, and the performance of civil disobedience is stigmatized in that sense. So what do you think are the kinds of logics that lead to this kind of internalization in the population that civil disobedience, for instance, is actually anti-national or unpatriotic?
Right. Yeah, within the Singaporean context, that's how the state paints this kind of activism. And there is a politician in Singapore, his name is Chee, and he's with the Singapore Democratic Party. So he started on a series of civil disobedience campaigns from the late 1990s all the way through the 2000s. And throughout that period, the media worked hand in hand with the party and the government to paint him as someone who was unpatriotic, who criticized Singapore when he goes abroad. And they even went as far as to say that he was a psychopath, because why would anyone knowingly break laws and keep doing it again and again and be subject to that kind of persecution if it wasn't for the fact that he's crazy? So that kind of imagery, that kind of narrative was being put out to the public persistently. And as a result, many people view civil disobedience in that kind of light, and they don't see it as a means of speaking truth to power, standing up for justice, but it just means that you are creating trouble. And a good activist doesn't create trouble. A good activist is someone that's constructive. You write research papers. You give solutions. You do a lot of quantitative data collection and analysis, and you present these findings in a very rational and cool way. So this is the preferred type of activism. And you stray from that script. You soon find that the media, the government, and the party will use its machinery to paint you into a corner and stigmatize your actions as a kind of warning to everyone else not to follow suit.
So in terms of how sort of it is portrayed by the state and its machinery, and you were discussing the story of Dr. Chee.
Right. So civil disobedience is seen as a very confrontational and unconstructive form of activism. So anyone who engages in it will have to be prepared for the state, the political party, and its underlings to paint you in a corner and to portray you as a troublemaker, as someone who is not constructive, as someone who doesn't. Sorry. Okay, we'll start again. So there is a politician, in Singapore. His name is Chee, and he's with the Singapore Democratic Party. So he started on a series of civil disobedience campaigns from the late 1990s all the way through to the 2000s. And when he did that, the party and state machinery came down hard on him. So they worked hand in hand to paint him as a troublemaker, and even went as far as to say that he was a psychopath. Because why would someone break the law repeatedly and risk going to jail, being charged in court and convicted, and still keep doing it? Yeah, so the media especially, because this is before the age of social media and Facebook, so and everyone was consuming their news through the state. So the state media basically just portray him as this crazy guy. Yeah, until this day, many people still have that kind of impression of him, though that has changed somewhat because of social media. Yeah, but the remnants of that still remain. Yeah.
So I find this so perplexing because by this logic, Gandhi would be a sociopath.
Yes, that's right. And so would Martin Luther King
right?
and Rosa Parks. Yeah. So, but it really shows how effective, the state has been in creating its preferred narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
But one thing also, I remember you mentioning at one point that it is Dr. Chee's activism that actually led to gains such as the Speaker's Corner in Singapore.
Yes, that's right. So while many people in Singapore may rubbish civil disobedience, but it was because of civil disobedience that the government decided that it would legalize certain forms of public assembly. And what they did in the end was to create a speaker's corner Speaker's Corner, which is like a little park in Singapore. I still think it's a joke, to only allow citizens to assemble, in a small little park on anything that's political or cause related. Yeah, it's a joke. Yeah, but it's an improvement from the past because before the creation of Speaker's Corner, citizens didn't have the right to assemble freely in any public space. Yeah, but because of this series of civil disobedience campaigns, we now have a space. Even though it's a very small space, it is a very constricted space, but it's a space nonetheless that exists. And many people have organized political events, and the annual Gay Pride rally in Singapore is also held there. Yeah, and in fact, the LGBT movement in Singapore owes a debt to the civil disobedience campaigns, because it was with the creation of Speaker's Corner that they were able to launch their annual Pink Dot, which is an event where people come together all dressed in pink, to rally for the freedom to love regardless of sexual orientation. So that event has been very successful in the past decade, and that success would not have been possible if it wasn't for the creation of Speaker's Corner.
So in that sense, a lot of contemporary narratives often obfuscate the hard work, the labor, the sacrifices of those that have taken a lot of risk to push the state.
Yes, that's right. So that the history of Speaker's Corner, how it came about, has been completely erased. Yeah. So it seems as if the Prime Minister woke up one day and decided to give us Speaker's Corner, and it's as if he was suddenly so enlightened, to give us our rights. Yeah, but that's not true. And we know through history that rights are not served up to you on a plate. Yeah, people had to fight for it. Yeah, and this was exactly what happened. But this history does not exist in the mainstream consciousness because it has not been told at all by anyone.
It's again, I find interesting that you talk about rights and how rights have to be sought through struggle. And I find that quite contradictory to the literature that I have read, written by Singapore academics, that talk about two things. One, the language of rights does not work within the vernacular context of Singapore.
Right.
And the two being that Singapore's development story culturally is different from the cultural stories of development in the West, where rights belong. How would you respond to that?
It's true that any talk about human rights tends to be ignored by the population, but that's not because Singaporeans inherently don't understand rights, but because of the way the discourse has been shaped, the way civil society has been controlled, the way our politics has been controlled. It has made us hostile to rights. And but as an activist who wants entering this space, how then do we talk about rights in a way which resonates with people? So you don't really have much of a choice sometimes, but to have to work within this framework that the state has imposed on you. Yeah, so when I was doing my migrant rights work, I hardly talked about rights. Yeah, but what I did a lot of was tell stories. Yeah, telling stories of how oppression has affected a low-wage migrant worker who's been abused and exploited. Yeah, so when these stories are told, people who are not interested in human rights will be able to relate to these narratives, and then from there you at least have some kind of a platform, yeah, to start talking about rights. Yeah, so the entry point always has to be something that people are familiar with, people don't find difficult to talk about. Yeah, so I've often found that telling stories is a good way to start the conversation about rights.
With that kind of strategy, and I have similar questions with the strategy of closed door meetings,
Right,
where
yes.
also one might tell stories to convince policymakers, might also have certain drawbacks in terms of perpetuating the same kind of hegemonic space.
Right.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yes. So again, it is a kind of activism that it's co-opted. Yeah. So the only way in which you can talk about rights is to tell stories. Yeah. But I think there's nothing wrong with doing that actually inherently. Yeah. But what makes it problematic then is that everyone then approaches activism in a certain way. Yeah, whether it's telling stories, whether it's doing research, yeah, whether it's writing policy proposals and papers, there's nothing wrong with doing this kind of work. Yeah, but what makes it problematic is that these forms of activism are privileged over others, and things like closed-door discussions with policymakers and politicians. Yeah, this is another form of activism that the state prefers. Yeah, but in Singapore, everyone does that. Yes, and anyone who strays off this script then becomes stigmatized. Yeah, but social change is something which requires a diversity of tactics. Yeah, I'm not saying that everyone should be engaged in civil disobedience. I'm not saying everyone should protest. I'm not saying that everyone should write a petition. Yeah, but there has to be a diversity of tactics in order for us to be able to call ourselves a community that values change, that values different ways of doing things. Yeah, and this is what makes us truly democratic. Yeah.
So, I find it quite appealing, your imaginary for true democracy in Singapore. How do you envision that happening?
In Singapore, I think, it's tough, yeah. There is no democratic project, so to speak. I think democracy is something in which people have to do on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, and we need to support different acts of democracy, whether that means supporting an opposition political party, whether that means volunteering with them, donating to them, or whether it means speaking up on social media about issues that you care about, organizing a protest at Speaker's Corner, or whether it is meeting your elected representative to talk about issues that concern you, or organizing a community to come together to discuss. Yeah, so all these are different acts that people should engage in order to participate in order to participate in a democratic society. So I think being an active citizen, but being an active citizen in a more political kind of way, is what we need to do in order to open up the democratic space. Yeah.
One might call that consummateization, and according to the Minister of Education, consummateization is something that is not allowed in Singapore.
Yes. So while you're allowed to raise awareness, but you shouldn't make issues which affect people on a daily basis, you shouldn't connect it to a wider structural and political. No, let me say that again. While you are allowed to raise awareness, you shouldn't be connecting these issues to a wider political structure. Yeah, it's when you do that that it becomes dangerous.
You know, one of the things that is often articulated in the literature on Singapore activism is sort of this notion of pragmatism or pragmatic activism. The kinds of strategies you describe as the everyday life of democracy seem antithetical to that notion of pragmatism as well, you know.
Right.
So if one were to adopt that pragmatist ideology as the basis for activism, how then does that relate to the overarching project of democracy in Singapore?
Well, because pragmatism is often used as a justification for survival. Yeah, because if you don't want to be charged in court, you don't want to have your funding cut off, you need to adopt pragmatic approaches. But what that really means in practice is that you continue to legitimize one-party rule. Yeah, so you continue to make the ruling party look good. Yeah, in fact, you even allow the ruling party to take credit for work that you have done. Yeah, and that entrenches their rule. So what's problematic about pragmatic resistance is that it is fundamentally anti-democratic, yeah, and it does not promote diversity, and it only entrenches one-party rule. And I think anything that entrenches one-party rule is ultimately bad for Singapore, yeah, because in order for citizens to be able to participate actively in issues that concern them, in order for, I think, the long-term sustainability of our political system, we cannot be ossified, yeah, by the rule of just one political party.
So in that sense, you know, the combination pragmatic and resistance is itself a form of communicative inversion.
Yes, that's right. It's in some ways it's also a contradiction in terms,
Yes.
right? Like you pointed out earlier too. Yeah.
So, you know, Jolovan, as we move toward wrapping up, one of the things I want to say to you is that for me personally, you have been so inspiring because you're not an issue-specific activist, but rather you lend your voice in solidarity across issues. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Right, yes. I think that's important because a lot of our struggles are very similar. But in Singapore, people tend to be very issue-specific. And I would admit that when I started out, I was also very issue-specific. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the state circumscribes what you can do. So if your organization is working on women's rights, for instance, yeah, you shouldn't be doing, other types of activism that stray out of your organizational mandate, yeah, because you are forced through laws which the government imposes on you to follow your organization's constitution, and this constitution has to be approved by the government. And if your constitution says that you are only supposed to work on this issue, then you cannot work on any other issues. Yeah, so a lot of the way. So the reason why solidarity is something which a lot of activists don't do is because the state imposes these restrictions on you. Yeah.
So what are the costs that you've had to pay for sort of being in solidarity across issues?
Right. What are the costs that you have to pay for being in solidarity? I don't. There are very few groups that actually. I mean, I find that personally, even if as an organization, you cannot express solidarity with other groups, but solidarity doesn't always just have to be public, especially if you are working in an authoritarian state. It's difficult to be public about a lot of things. Yeah, but solidarity can just be as simple as reaching out to someone. Yeah, even if it's just sending a WhatsApp message, right, and talking to someone, saying that you support what he or she does. Yeah, so I think that's important, and the cost to, so it need not necessarily be a cost, but if you decide to be very public in your solidarity, then you need to be prepared to be scolded by government officials, by politicians, or maybe even have your funding cut off from sources which are, I'm sorry. So tell me the cost of solidarity. So if you are public in your solidarity, then you need to be prepared to be reprimanded by the state, by politicians, and to have your funding cut off.
Now, one of the things is that I referred to again the recent module that was going to be offered at Yale NUS on dissent in Singapore, and you were one of the speakers at the event. And then, when the Minister of Education, Ong Ye Kung, delivered his speech in the Parliament, he sort of framed as you, Silan, Kristen, PJ Tham as against the interests of the state. So I want to wrap up by asking you this question. Do you love Singapore?
Well, it's a funny question. I don't quite believe in patriotism.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm very skeptical of patriotism and nationalism. Yeah. So I wouldn't say I love Singapore, because what does it even mean in the first place? I mean, I love the people that I interact with in Singapore. I love the people who are part of my community. But I would be the last person to say that I love the country, because the country is such a vague, abstract concept. And I think it's important to be guided by a sense of what is right, rather than a sense of what your love is for an entity that is so difficult to define.
This question I find really pertinent, especially as the term anti-national is invoked in so many different contexts to silence critical voices.
Right, yes, that's right. So, but because the nationalist discourse is so strong in Singapore, that becomes weaponized to stigmatize and marginalize those who are critical and think differently. So I'm often very skeptical when even some activists themselves invoke nationalism and love for the country for the work that they do, because I'm just so aware of how that can be, that same concept, that same notion has been used against the community. And in fact, in an authoritarian country like Singapore, where the state, the politician, where every organ of the state, and where even the people are seen as one entity, I think then being anti-national is a patriotic act, right? Burning the Singapore flag becomes a patriotic act, because the flag then is no longer a symbol of its people, but it's a symbol of authoritarianism.
So what's your hope for Singapore?
What's my hope for Singapore? Well, I hope that it will be a country that values its people in all its diverse forms, and not just in the way that it likes. I mean, the Singapore government likes to say that it is a diverse country, it values diversity, but it is a state-imposed kind of diversity. So if we want to be truly diverse, we need a country that does not do things like crack down on activists, crack down on people that they don't like, but give people the freedom to flourish, to pursue their passions and their interests, without feeling that they are being persecuted, marginalized, or isolated from